Hi everyone, and welcome to this month's edition of the Influential Times. We're sort of mixing it up. We're living that hybrid working lifestyle. So we're back to remote this week, and we are going to be talking about all of the biggest stories in social and influence this week. So to kick us off, my lovely assistant Tom is going to talk you through some stories about TikTok's creator program.
Yeah, I was going to say we've got a few bits to catch up on, Jack, because I don't know if we did. I don't think we did one in December, so there's probably a good few weeks worth of news to catch up on in our space. But yeah, some news from TikTok or some commentary, I guess, around what's been happening there. Obviously, Jack, we talked last year about the pledge from a few of the social media companies to sort of pay creators, and there was almost a sort of fund allocated from each of them, from likes of Meta and TikTok, etc., to put towards creators, because obviously clearly creator generated content is super important for those platforms. And there's been a little bit of a criticism of TikTok and the way that their kind of model is working. Question marks on how effective these initiatives are going. There's been issues with certain influencers getting particularly low payouts when you look in comparison with their followings, and also there's been some difficulty with actually getting the funds paid, etc. So a couple of issues there. One of the examples was a YouTube star called Mr. Beast. He's one of the biggest YouTubers, and he earned $54 million last year. Not a bad earning, but actually only 15k of that came from TikTok. So but he's got 32 million followers on TikTok. So I guess it's not really relative to what he's his following on there. So I think one of the concerns for TikTok here is that they don't really have their sort of revenue share model. It doesn't work quite the same as how platforms like YouTube do it, and over time they do risk run the risk of losing talent to YouTube, Meta, Snapchat, other platforms like that. So yeah, interesting that the model is up and running, Jack, but perhaps not running as smoothly or there's a few sort of kinks to iron out in that process.
Yeah, agreed. I think there's sort of a long-held tradition, it seems like over the last couple of years, YouTube is often where sort of people who make a start somewhere else end up, because it seems to be the place where it's easiest to monetize fans. You tend to get a sort of ad read almost that's a good length. So for advertisers, that's attractive. If a lot of creators will sort of have a sponsor for their video, and there'll be maybe 60 to 90 seconds of ad read for that, often kind of smoothly in the middle of a video. And so I think maybe advertisers have the most confidence in that as a sort of established and mature model. So not surprising that TikTok is struggling. It is just a hard thing to get right, and I think you can see that from the fact that like lots of platforms have struggled, and that now that the sort of initial battle for creators has died down, it's kind of now just about executing well, I think, for all of these platforms in terms of what's the functionality that's going to keep users engaged, and what's the functionality that you're going to be able to ship to kind of generate an edge in terms of your experience for creators, and what are the tools that they have to kind of manage, how do they grow their following, how do they monetize their following, how do they for example help to sort of manage their mental health while they're online. That's obviously a big concern. I think part of the picture is going to be or one area where some platforms could really develop an edge is if they are smart about those sorts of tools. Like, how do you filter out negative comments? We've talked recently about YouTube sort of hiding the dislike count to sort of try and stop those nasty pylons, and I think that's quite an interesting strand of all of this. Will be kind of who gains the edge. But speaking of functionality, your second story is about another someone else, copying functionality broadly.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think it's been no real secret that LinkedIn have been developing a kind of virtual event space, which we'd obviously heard a bit about last year, but they're basically doing it in a kind of phased approach. So they're going to launch an audio only product. Actually, I think it went out in beta testing in January. and then they're going to move across to video in the spring, which I think is actually quite a smart move, because it means they can sort of test it out. They can see what kind of, how the sessions are going and what kind of attendance they're getting. There's also a question around ticketing and paid and things like that. But then they'll move more towards video. And I think this is really interesting for our industry, Jack, and what we do, because I think, we've seen how well LinkedIn Live has been utilized by our clients and how people like that sort of live like content format. Like, it's quite natural, it's not too staged, you get some really good interesting conversations going. And I think it's kind of probably the evolution of that to the next stage. So I think it's been really interesting. And actually their product manager, Jack Poses, he was quoted saying that the idea of this ultimately is they just want to make it far easier to for creators to host virtual roundtables, fireside chats, those kinds of content formats. Which I think is really interesting. On the ticketing side of things, because I think we possibly had a story last year that was around that question of ticketed events and things. Interestingly, it seems LinkedIn are going to go more towards it being free to start with. I think probably just get people adopting it, get people signing up to sessions, get creators running sessions. I think the challenge then will be on the creator side, a bit like what I was saying about TikTok. You obviously have to make sure creators are incentivized and motivated to run the sessions, otherwise there isn't a product there. So I think get people on there, get people adopted, but also there's probably going to be a strategy of how they're going to reward creators over time for those interesting sessions.
I think the other piece, then the other sort of side of that coin, is the user experience as an ordinary user. Is how are you going to what will differentiate this from the absolutely astronomical other bits of screen time we're all clocking up over the last 2 years, and kind of how are you going to introduce those dynamic elements. And I think you see lots of people get creative with the way they use Q&A, the way they use the sort of chat functions in meetings. But I mean, I guess maybe an interesting question for you as a sort of as a user of events, maybe as a as one of our sales leads, is could you see yourself actually at this point picking up kind of having those meetings, or where you get chatting to someone at an event? I guess the question is, what functionality do you think they'd have to really replicate that part of the experience? Where you just meet and chat to people and make connections.
I think where they've got a great opportunity with it, I think there's a couple of aspects. I think one is the fact that they are LinkedIn, so they've got their 800 million user base, and we all go and log into LinkedIn every day, and we use it in all of our different respective roles and departments for different things. So I think everyone kind of will have a LinkedIn account. That's one advantage. I think secondly, the fact that they've kind of maybe waited and watched the virtual event space play out over the last 2 years. And we've seen it where things have fallen down, like Clubhouse has obviously fallen away a little bit. We've certainly attended some virtual events, and they've maybe not been as good as what we thought they'd be. So I guess they've kind of learned a lot about where some of the pitfalls have happened. And like you say, they can maybe put together a really good product which suits salespeople, where they can actually genuinely connect with someone, or spark a conversation in a separate room, or I don't know. There'll probably be some really cool functionality that will benefit different personas that would want to join the sessions. So I think the fact they've sat back and watched everything unfold probably puts them in a really strong position. Plus the fact they are LinkedIn and they've got that user base.
Yeah, got a really established user base. They've got a really established set of tools for people who like to network, like recruitment professionals, sales professionals, marketers who will want to network and talk. And you've almost got the new business card is your LinkedIn profile in that scenario. You're kind of in someone's Rolodex, as it were, forever. So we'll have to see how they get on. I'm kind of ultimately, to me, nothing will ever sort of quite replicate just going and standing in an office I've never been in before in some part of London I don't visit very often, and eating some free pizza at someone's expense and listening to a talk and kind of just chatting to people afterwards. But that's not to say it's we don't get value. I attended a meetup last week for product professionals where we were able to hear from someone based in Australia, and that kind of thing is just you can't do in person. And it's nice that actually it has sort of the last couple of years reminded us that we can still connect with people at scale.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, for sure. And we are lucky to have the tech we do. Even 10, 20 years ago, this pandemic would not have been nearly as bearable, I think.
That's definitely true
in a lot of ways. Yeah. So my first story, I've got two to talk about this month. The first one is Twitter is sort of, to keep on the theme of the major social platforms and the kind of functionality that they're rolling out. Twitter are sort of maturing the creator, the creator accounts or the professional or business accounts into this kind of tier that they're calling professional accounts. And it's bringing together a lot of the strands. I think the super follow, the sort of newsletter format, the about section, the business profile, all of that I think is, from what I can tell from the announcement, and we'll link to it in the newsletter as always. So by all means, sort of feel free to peruse this if you're listening and see if you think I've kind of got the right impression. But what it looks like is they're pulling all of that together into a sort of solid tier. And I guess maybe a little bit like the way that there is LinkedIn Premium, and then there is a sales, navigator product, there is a recruiter product, there's kind of a suite of marketing tools. Possibly they're kind of thinking that way, and it looks like they're talking about business, for example. So if you are a business, you can have your shop there, in the way that Instagram has also kind of integrated some of that. So tricky one for Twitter, because I think unlike LinkedIn or Instagram to an extent, they don't have that sort of specialization of what people are there for in quite the same way. Brands, although they have to be there, sort of newsy, thought leadery people have to be there. Professionals are often there because that's kind of where the actual back and forth conversation is going. So yeah, tricky. I don't know if you've had a chance to sort of look through any of.
It's an interesting one. Like, I think it's definitely an interesting move from Twitter, and like some of the things they're doing. I think it's definitely really important to create more of help people to create more of a business profile on the platform. So I think if we think about Twitter, it's always been kind of, you're either a verified account or you're not, and that's kind of been the only kind of distinction. And there's lots of bot accounts, and it can be quite like noisy as well. But I think just to add that extra element of like on the business side, I think will definitely help. And I'm sure there'll be lots of features that will be rolled out to support that as well.
Yeah, I guess they're continuing to act in the spirit of trying innovate and test things. Fleets, for example, kind of flopped. I don't think anyone there would really deny it. And ultimately, maybe these things, when all of these companies are publicly listed, so it's sometimes seen as more of a drama than it really is. Whereas to those of us in the software industry, we know that's what it's like. Sometimes you launch a feature, you try it, it doesn't have the effect you expected. And when you've got such a large user base and so many important and kind of busy people and people all trying to use your software for so many different things, use it, that's just kind of normal.
Exactly. That's kind of how they kind of, when they announced that Fleets was going, it was kind of their attitude, wasn't it? It was kind of like, it's going, and that's just how it is. It's not really a big deal. It didn't quite work out how they maybe envisaged.
Yeah, and I suppose maybe this is just kind of me going soft on other product professionals and kind of trying to take their corner. But there we go. Spotify's product team, on the other hand, are at the other end of that cycle. They're launching something new, which is, I think, quietly quite a big deal in social audio and particularly podcasting, because the sort of ability to crack ads on podcasts is quite a tricky one. The targeting is often not very good, and it's almost based on sort of topical interest and a lot of guessing about what an audience for a podcast might be interested in. And Spotify have a lot of data comparatively about their users compared to some sort of other podcast platforms, and they've kind of got the clout to try and build more tools for hosting and kind of using your podcast. So something that they've just brought in is an actual sort of clickable ad within the app. So if you've got your podcast up on your phone, for example, you're listening to it, you'll actually have a kind of sponsorship tile overlaid on the podcast as you listen to it, with a click through to a sort of given link, which I think is quite an interesting step. It's kind of almost bringing podcast advertising into the 21st century a little bit with sort of targeting and the detail. But I think if it does work, it could see sort of Spotify quickly picking up more market share as it just becomes the platform that's cracked advertising. I suppose, unfortunately, Apple are well ahead of them in terms of market share of the podcasting business, in terms of where the users are. And this is not, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Do get in touch if you know that I'm wrong, but this is not a particularly difficult feature to replicate. So you could get
of course,
Clubhouse syndrome. It's like, oh, that's a good idea, we'll have that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, actually, the podcast thing. Like, I guess from my perspective, I listen to quite a few podcasts, and I've found.
And you are a podcaster.
Well, yeah, exactly. I run a podcast as well, so I guess I see it from both sides. I think I found myself when I know there's a podcast I listen to that have like 2 or 3 adverts at the start, and you can quite easily skip the adverts, right? They doesn't force you. It's not like YouTube where you have to listen to at least a part of it and then skip it. It's kind of part of the audio track, right? So I find myself skipping that part. There's an advert in the middle, which is actually quite effective because it's the people who run the podcast actually doing the advert. So I actually find that quite good, and it's quite relatable because it's clearly like I'm the demographic for that, because it's a football podcast that I listen to. So that works quite well. I guess look, like on the phone, would people be looking at it all the time? I'm not sure. But I can see the value, because I'm sure there's people who will say, I find adverts really annoying on podcasts and I'd rather see the advert on my phone. And then it's that, I guess, brand, repetition, and over time you will see it.
Not to mention, if you're the showrunner of the podcast, the attribution is then clearly from you. There's a kind of tracking on that link, rather than you have to read out a code that people use to get X off for attribution, which people might not do. You might be generating great brand awareness for a brand by doing the ad read, but just because people don't go and buy that day, that doesn't mean they didn't actually come from your podcast. So in terms of actually proving your value to advertisers, it could be a bit of a breakthrough.
No, definitely. Yes, it's very interesting.
Yeah, so probably not the biggest story for Spotify and podcasting that they've had this month, with the sort of scandal they've gotten themselves embroiled in with Mr. Rogan. But I think a sort of quietly interesting one for those of us who follow, for kind of marketers who are interested in podcasts as a way to reach their audience, and I think one to kind of keep an eye on. The bonus link this month actually is similar to that. It's a little bit old, but I think worth listening to. It's from right at the end of last year. It's a link to another podcast, in fact, by Recode Media, someone called Peter Kafka. They're part of the Vox Media Group, and it's just an overview of the year in podcasting, everything that's happened. It actually touches on Joe Rogan. The guest that they have on estimates that he's possibly lost as much as half of his audience by moving to Spotify. Which I thought was interesting, but a really good overview of kind of everything that's been going on in podcasting recently. All of the things to be sort of keeping an eye on. So yeah, look out for that in the newsletter, and we will see you all again in a month's time.
Cheers, everyone. Thanks for listening.